familiar faces as well. It's nice to see you all, familiar faces as well as new faces. Always a pleasure. Shall we start now, Vincent, or should we wait a couple more, maybe a couple more minutes?
Yes, I'm allowing the people, as you speak right now, so it's fine. I think we can start if you like, unless you want to take an extra minute.
Let's take an extra minute to make sure we admit,
yes, okay,
people, because it's just 10 sharp, so.
Yeah, fine. So I'm allowing more people. People are now queuing up, as it were. So.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning. Hi.
There are 35 people connected right now. So, and there's still one person in the waiting room for some reason, but.
Okay, well, I guess I'm going to start then.
Yeah.
Because that's a pretty fair number, I think. Well, welcome everybody again, or if you've attended the very first session of our MIDIB webinar series about 2 to 3 weeks ago, and welcome if you're coming for the first time to participate, to attend this second session of what we hope will be a long and fruitful series. So I'm not going to talk for hours because I've already made a short introduction about the network last time. Suffice it to say this time, I will say a few words for people who join us for the first time. MIDIB is an international and interdisciplinary network that aims at bringing together and encouraging exchanges between academics from different fields working on immigration and cultural diversity in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, looking also specifically at Northern Irish, Welsh, Scottish and English developments, themes and issues related to migration diversity. And as I was saying, we've already had, this is the second session of our webinar series, which is the first activity that we're having as part of this new network. The last session has been recorded. It was about mobilization against immigration and cultural diversity in the UK on the 26th of March. It's been recorded and it's been placed on the blog. So I'm just going to put in the chat box the address, the web link to the blog, because this is an important point of references for us. This is where all the future recordings will be posted. So if you take note of this is where you also can find the web links and the program to the seminar sessions. So it's an important point of reference for anyone who wants to know more about MIDIB. I'm also giving you the email address of MIDIB that you can write to us for any question, inquiry about or proposal for activities, or proposals to join the network, midib.com@gmail.com. I'm just, before letting the organizer and the chair of today's session, Thibaud Harrois, who's one of my colleagues at the Sorbonne Nouvelle here in Paris, I'm just going to say one word about the next session. So far we've got 5 sessions planned, which you can see on which you can get all the details on the blog. Next time will be, so the third session will be on Friday, 21st of May, from 10 to 11:15, and it's called "It Dread Inner England: The Influence of Caribbean Immigrants on British Popular Culture and Politics." And that'll be a talk by David Bousquet, who's a lecturer in British Studies at the University of Burgundy in Dijon. So without further ado, Thibaud Harrois, if you want to introduce the session today, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Romain. Thank you also to Vincent for organizing this webinar. So today, we're very happy to welcome 2 speakers. Originally, the panel should have included more people, but the latest version is composed of two speakers. So Jonathan Ports, who is a professor, professor of economics and public policy at King's College London, and also associated with the UK in a Changing Europe initiative, which is also based at King's, but has a wider impact than King's College. And I'm sure you're familiar with it if you're interested in Brexit, as some people among us are today. So Jonathan has a rich experience in other sectors. He's been also involved in the civil service before becoming a professor at King's College. So we're very happy to have you today, Jonathan. He's going to talk about UK and immigration after Brexit. And the second speaker who is here today is Paul James Cardwell, who is a professor of law at Strathclyde University, who has been professor of law at Strathclyde University until today at least, and who will join City University in London very soon. So we're very happy to have you both, two specialists of Brexit and immigration on slightly different approaches. More legal approach for Paul James Cardwell, more economic approach maybe for Jonathan, who is going to be the first speaker now. So Jonathan, we're very happy to listen to you now.
Merci beaucoup, Thibaud. Carrément. I thank you very much for inviting me. I would be lying if I did not admit that I would have enjoyed the invitation even more if I could physically have been in Paris, particularly over the weekend which preceded this, since normally that is what my partner and I would do on receipt of such a kind invitation. But hopefully you'll invite me back when it is once again possible for us to get on the Eurostar and see you all in person. I'm going to share my screen now, and let's see whether that works. I'm going to talk a bit about the history of the economic history, primarily of immigration to the UK over perhaps the last 2 decades, but particularly over the last 5 years, and assess how we got to this point, and what we think has been happening, which is actually surprisingly difficult to assess, and speculate on what might happen next and what the key issues are. So first, the history, and I while this may well be familiar to those of you who study the UK, it is nonetheless, I think, particularly striking. Don't look at the very far right, because I'm going to come back to that again right at the end of my presentation, the dip at the end. But look at the main lines on the graph, which look at the number of workers, first in green, born outside the European Union, and second in blue, the lower line, born within the European Union, the number of workers in the UK who were born outside the UK. This goes back to the late 1990s, which is when the Blair government took office, when I first started working on this topic as a civil servant, just at the beginning of this enormous takeoff. And so what you can see is this huge expansion in migrant presence in the UK labour market, with the number of people from outside the EU more than doubling from 1.5 million at the start to well over 3 million last year. And these, those of you who are familiar with UK statistics may be familiar with a somewhat lower number, because typically both the Office for National Statistics sometimes and Eurostat most of the times present figures on foreign citizens. Of course, lots of people come to the UK as immigrants and then acquire nationality. This gets around that definitional change by looking at people who are born outside the UK. And as you can see, there's been this very large number of people from outside the EU. And then in the blue line shows the number of people born within the EU. And here you can see very much more clearly the influence of accession. First, the first big rise upwards, which begins in 2004 with the expansion of the EU to the east, the AA countries, and then a second big expansion, which begins roughly in 2000, goes from 2011 to 2015, and that reflects the ending of transitional controls on citizens of Bulgaria and Romania, who, well, sorry, 2014, not 2011, who joined the EU in 2007, but transitional controls did not expire until 2014, after which some of them had probably already been in the UK irregularly before then. But in the statistics, at least, you see this very sharp upward movement. And I should note that we have some of us, particularly, had always argued that these numbers, which come from the official labour force survey, significantly underestimated, in particular, the number of Bulgarians and Romanians in the EU, in the UK after 2014, and hence both these numbers overall, in particular the increase after 2014, were significantly understated. We have, I and a couple of others have been arguing this since about 2015. We now know, of course, that we were absolutely correct, since the number of EU citizens who have applied for permission to remain in the UK after Brexit under the settled status program is very much larger than the numbers implied by the blue line here. And that is particularly the case for Bulgarians and Romanians. So the number of Bulgarians and Romanians who we estimate through the official population statistics, as shown here, estimate to be in the UK is considerably lower than the number who have actually applied and indeed been accepted under the settled status scheme. Indeed, the original estimate was that a total of roughly 3.4 million EU citizens were resident in the UK as of about 2018. That's a bigger number than the blue line here, since this shows only those employed, but it's consistent with that blue line, is the 3.4 million number, which some of you probably saw in the press at the time as the estimated number of EU citizens who were eligible to apply. Well, so far, about 4.5 million EU citizens have actually successfully applied already. So the numbers that we thought were present were indeed a significant underestimate. There are various definitional reasons why you wouldn't expect those numbers to correspond exactly. And in particular, you know, people can go, come back, they don't have to be resident permanently and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, we do now, I think, know that the official statistics have been for some time underestimating the number of EU citizens resident in the UK, particularly those from Bulgaria and Romania. So that shows that the trend over the last 20 years. What's been happening, what sort of happened pre-Brexit? And oops, sorry, went on one, two. This shows the official immigration statistics, not the population statistics, which were on the previous slide. What you see here is net migration. The very bottom line, which is negative, is the net migration of British citizens. Of course, you'd always expect there to be some net outflow of British citizens. But more importantly, the two lines on the top are the blue line and the yellow line are net migration of EU and non-EU citizens. And what this shows is the very significant change in at least measured migration since Brexit. So again, you see a sharp run up in EU migration in the years preceding the Brexit referendum, in particular as a consequence of, as I said, the Bulgarian and Romanian ending of transitional controls. And that really peaked literally at the time of the referendum, the highest ever level of migration overall and EU migration in particular was recorded in the year to June of 2016. And for that previous couple of years, net EU migration exceeded net non-EU migration for the first time since we have remotely credible statistics on immigration. That changed immediately after the referendum for a variety of factors, including economic factors, the changing cyclical positions of labor markets, and particular recovery in some of the labor markets of the main source countries, but also the post-referendum fall in sterling, which clearly made the UK unattractive to people who were thinking mentally about what wages they might earn in the UK in terms of their home country currency, but also psychological. Obviously, as you all know, nothing changed at all legally in terms of the rights of EU citizens, free movement, work, and all the rest of it in the UK. But there was clearly a psychological impact on EU citizens as to whether the UK remained as attractive a destination as it had been. I think there are also the extent to which that simply exhaustion of potential migrant sources, in the sense that by 2016, many, if not most, of the Bulgarians and Romanians in particular who generated that pre-2016 surge were already in the UK. So there may just not have been that many of them left to come. Anyway, as you can see, there was then a sharp fall in EU migration. However, this was not an exodus, in the sense that while there was some return migration, it was still outweighed, at least in the published statistics, by new immigration. Net migration from the EU remained positive at all points until the start of the pandemic. So the UK was still a net importer of people from Europe, even after the Brexit referendum. But what you can also see here is a quite significant further rise in non-EU migration after the pandemic. Non-EU migration had fallen as a consequence of some of the restrictionist measures taken by Theresa May after the 2010 general election. It fell for a number of years as restrictions were tightened up. But it rose again after 2016 as a consequence both of some de facto liberalization. Particularly, it became somewhat easier to navigate the hurdles required to get student visas. A lot of this is measured non-EU visas, in fact, people coming to the UK to study. There was some liberalization of the rules, which in turn was a result of the fall of EU migration. That is to say, employers found it more difficult to hire European workers, particularly for some skilled jobs in the NHS. Political pressure therefore led the government to loosen up restrictions on non-EU migration. But for whatever reason, non-EU migration reached a peak again just before the start of the pandemic. So what can we say in one slide, as it were? This is my attempt to summarize 2 decades of research by economists. Some of it's mine, many of it is due to many other economists in the UK. What can we say about the impact of migration, this very large increase in the penetration of migrants within the UK labour market? What are the economic impacts of that migration? And we do now have, as a consequence of academic research and also research commissioned or undertaken by the Migration Advisory Committee, the UK's independent advisory committee on migration issues, we now have quite a large body of research evidence. I think the first thing, the first and perhaps most important thing, both from an economic and political point of view, is that we do not really observe any negative impact on the employment of native workers. What economists call the lump of labor fallacy is indeed a fallacy. There are not a fixed number of jobs to go around. Jobs are created in the UK labour market more or less one for one by and alongside the introduction of migrants to that labour market. We have lots and lots of detailed econometric studies which illustrate this or attempt to show this in a causal fashion. But perhaps the easiest way of visualizing it at the macro level is simply to say that at the same time as we've seen these very large increases in the number of migrants in the UK labour market, the employment rate for the UK born, the people who aren't on those charts, people like me who were born in the UK, the employment rate for UK natives is actually at the highest rate in recorded economic history, again, just before the pandemic. There had never been a time, as you know, in the statistics at least, where a greater proportion of British born people had actually had a job, which is hard to reconcile with the idea that there have been any significant displacement of native workers. What about wages? We do see some wage impacts, but they appear, direct wage impacts appear to be rather small. Overall, on average, wages don't appear to change much directly as a consequence of the increase of migrant penetration in a sector or region or local authority. But there may be some distributional impacts, and in particular, some depression of wages at the lower end for some low-paid groups, in particular in the lower skilled service sector, by which we mean people working in cafes, bars, restaurants, and so on, typically retail. There isn't, those impacts don't appear to be very large. They appear to be likely dominated by other things going on in the labour market. In particular, in the UK over the last 10 years, very large increases in the national minimum wage, which mean that actually income inequality or earnings inequality in the UK has actually decreased over the last decade, perhaps surprisingly because of these increases in the minimum wage and despite any immigration impacts. The impact on the taxes, fiscal impacts, looking at both the benefits to the resulting from migration to revenues and costs in terms of increased payments and benefits in public services appear to be positive. And the most recent work by the Migration Advisory Committee looking at life cycle impacts suggests that as well as being positive in the short term, they're also likely to be positive over the medium to long term. Despite the aging process for migrants, we still see a net benefit over the life cycle. But I think it's also fair to say these benefits are not huge in macroeconomic terms. And then in terms of more political implications, economists have struggled to find any evidence of adverse impacts, direct or indirect, either on public services or on the welfare state. On the whole, even at a local level, migration doesn't seem to add much to pressure on services. There's no observed correlation between migration and, say, increases in NHS waiting times. There's no evidence of, obviously, some migrants do claim benefits, and no doubt there are anecdotal instances of welfare benefit tourism, people coming because the benefit system is in some respects more generous, although in some respects less so in the UK than in other European countries. But overall, the quantitative impact of such of so-called welfare or benefit or health tourism appears to be 0 to very close to 0. So overall, I think the conclusion is that the UK labour market has responded rather well to migration, rather better than I would have to say. You know, when I was chief economist at the Department of Work and Pensions in 2004, and we saw these very large flows from Eastern Europe in particular, we were certainly concerned about potential adverse impacts on the labour market because it was of a scale that we had not previously experienced in and concentrated in particular regions and sectors in a way which we hadn't particularly experienced. And I think I'm happy to admit that I was pleasantly surprised to see that we really did find, even in the short term, the sort of negative impacts on wages and jobs that we might otherwise would have feared. By contrast, however, of course, the political reaction was far less benign. Although there is a huge and ever-growing literature on the drivers of the Brexit vote, why did the UK vote for Brexit, both looking at this from a broader political science perspective and a more quantitative analysis of detailed drivers at the individual and local level, I don't think that there is any serious doubt that one way or another, immigration, in particular free movement, were key political drivers of the Brexit vote. I shan't discuss the evidence on that. Many of you will be familiar with it, but I think, you know, whether you describe it as being directly about immigration and free movement, whether you talk about sovereignty or taking back control or all the rest of it, there really is no doubt that they were key to both the campaign and to the underlying reason why the Vote Leave campaign was ultimately successful. But more importantly, for this topic, they were key drivers of the form that Brexit took. And again, in some respects, the debate in the UK has sort of moved on to not a bit from why did we get the Brexit vote, but why have we got the particular form of a very hard Brexit that we have. It's fair to say, I think there is a lot of blame potentially to go round. A lot of people have absorbed a lot of energy in trying to assign blame to the people who voted down Theresa May's deal, to the leadership of the Remain, the Continuity Remain campaign, to misjudgments within the leaderships of the Conservative and Labour Party and so on. But I think ultimately, standing back, it is very hard not to conclude that once free movement had become the central issue in the campaign, and once Theresa May had made the ending of free movement one of her key red lines, even before Article 50 was notified in March 2017, that to some extent the form of Brexit was by and large already prescribed. That the combination of the UK's red line on ending free movement and the EU's red line that free movement was an integral, was an indivisible and integral part of the single market, that there were no four freedoms without the fourth freedom of free movement, those two red lines taken together dictated the form of Brexit that we have now. Possibly not every twist and turn, possibly not some of the acrimony that we've seen in some respects over it, but that essentially once those two positions had been made clear, and I shan't go in today as to the rights and wrongs of those, either economic or political. No doubt we'll have some discussion of that in questions. That in turn determined the nature of the Brexit, which we are currently, which is currently transpiring. But returning to immigration, I think one remarkable, and this perhaps is less known outside the UK, is the remarkable shift of opinion of public opinion in the UK towards immigration since the referendum. So this first chart shows the Ipsos Mori Issues Index, that is, which issues the people name when they're asked what are the most important issues, what are the most important issues facing the country. These totals add up to more than 100 because you can name 2 or 3 issues if you want. But what you can see is that in 2016, immigration was named as one of the most important issues facing the country by more than half the population, pretty much for the first time ever. And since then, it has remarkably plummeted down to about 10%. And again, this is pre-pandemic, so this is not a COVID effect since the pandemic. it's fallen even farther. Hardly anyone mentions it at all as an issue, which is understandable since it's not really happening. But even before that was the case, even with those relatively high levels of immigration, particularly from outside the EU, which we were seeing in 2019, it was not regarded as a major issue by most people, and certainly not as compared to other issues which were facing the country. And this is not just a matter. This shows how important people think immigration is an issue, salience. But that has also been paralleled by a slower but steadier and longer term trend on public opinion on immigration about attitudes for and against, positivity, negative. This is one particular series, again, Ipsos Mori, but you see a similar sort of series from things like the British Social Attitude Survey, the British Election Survey, which show that in general, the British public has become significantly more positive about immigration, really over the last 10 years, but particularly since the referendum. And this is, it is, I think, too early to say what exactly has driven this shift. Is this because people think that immigration has fallen, even though it hasn't actually before the pandemic fallen that much? Is it because they think that Brexit has somehow sorted the immigration issue, even though Brexit only happened from an immigration sense 3 months ago? Is it because of the Brexit having reduced at least EU immigration has changed the tone in the press towards immigration? There are fewer stories about Indian Romanians coming here to scrounge our benefits and more stories about hardworking Spanish nurses picking up and going home. Is it a combination of all of these things? We don't know, but it is nonetheless quite large and quite persistent. So I'll now come on to say, what happens next and discuss. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Paul has quite a lot of detail on it. So I thought I'd spend more my time on some of the broader historical perspective. But just briefly, this is the new system introduced on January the 1st. Not an Australian system and not really points-based, essentially a salary threshold system with a salary threshold of 2,500 rand. But the key macro level point I would make here is that for whatever reason, whether it's the political shifts I outlined on the previous slide or the shift from Theresa May, the most restrictionist prime minister from an immigration point of view in my living memory, to Boris Johnson, who, for all his many faults, is not an instinctive restrictionist on immigration. I think there was a reasonable view and a reasonable belief shared by me and many others that the Theresa May's objectives were fundamentally restrictionist, and that her objective was a new system which would essentially level down European migration to the sorts of restrictionist regime that she had already put in place for non-EU migrants. That is not what we have in this new system. This system does represent a reduction, a leveling down, as it were, for EU migrants. Clearly, the ending of free movement and the movement of this system is a reduction is a restrictionist move. But on the other hand, it is also quite a significant leveling up or move away from restrictionism for non-EU migrants. These restrictions are considerably less draconian than the restrictions that applied up to December 31st for those from outside the EU. The salary threshold is lower. There is no overall quota. There is no resident labor market test. Their skill requirements are lower. In all these respects, it now should be easier to come to the UK if you are coming from India or America than it was before Brexit. And then on top of this, we also have a wild card, which is the Hong Kong situation. And the radicalism of the government's move here, I think, is difficult to overstate. In principle, somewhat more than 5 million people from Hong Kong, 2.9 million people who are eligible to apply for British national overseas passports, and their 2.3 million dependents could, in principle, come to the UK on long-term visas, which lead ultimately to settlement and citizenship. Contrast that with Mrs. Thatcher, who, with broadly cross-party support, restricted the number of people who could come to Hong Kong to 50,000 in 1989 when the handover agreement was finalized. That is an incredible thing for any party, particularly the Conservative Party, to do. And it has been done, so far at least, with no backlash at all. I don't think a single Conservative MP has expressed public opposition. Some of them may have their private doubts, but they have not said that they think this is the wrong thing to do. They support from all the parties, and really the only opposition has come from a few fringe nativists and the usual anti-immigration suspects. So at the moment, there is this broad political consensus and no backlash for what in principle could be the biggest liberalization of UK immigration policy ever. Now, whether it works out that way, how many people actually come, of course, depends entirely on circumstances which are almost entirely outside the UK's control. If Hong Kong is stable and things settle down, and most Hong Kong grudgingly acquiesce to Chinese control, then the number who come could be in the tens of thousands. If, however, there is some sort of breaking point, and that clearly cannot be excluded, we could indeed be talking about many hundreds of thousands or more. And the upper estimate the UK government has put is 1 million people. That would be quite something, and would have quite profound impacts on the UK economy and society. So that is something of a wild card. We just don't know how it will pan out. But the fact the government has done it, felt able to do it, wanted to do it, and as I said, has done so to a remarkable degree, consensus, I think tells you something. Finally, I'm just going to review what we think the impact, again, I won't say too much of this because Paul will say, well, what might the impacts of the new system be? Well, we actually now have quite a lot of modeling attempts by economists to estimate these. I would say these are all very, very broad brush forecasts or stabs in the dark. It's notoriously difficult to forecast migration, let alone the economics and impacts of migration. But there are at least 5 or 6 different estimates. A couple of them are mine, some more from the government. But they all tend to converge on the reduction, medium to long-term reduction on EU migration compared to what otherwise might have happened is about 60,000 a year. And then there will be some corresponding offsetting increase, very difficult to quantify, and non-EU migration resulting from the liberalization I set out. And overall, that will reduce UK GDP, hardly surprising, fewer people means lower GDP. But the impact on GDP per capita is less clear, likely in these mostly static estimates to be rather small, could be slightly positive, could be slightly negative, depending again on the response of non-EU migration. If there is indeed a significant offsetting increase in non-EU skilled migration, one could imagine that the net impact might even be positive. And again, I think a sharp contrast to what would have been anticipated under a Theresa May style system, where I think almost every economist would agree that the impact would have been negative, both not just on GDP, but GDP per capita. Finally, what about COVID? And returning to my original slide, well, you can see that the COVID impact right in that last the last couple of points at the far right. If you believe the official statistics, there are now 1 million fewer people, very roughly, born outside the UK, currently resident than there were a year ago. That's an awful lot of people who, that would be a net immigration, a net outflow, unprecedented in recorded economic history, or unprecedented loss of population, a larger loss of population than we've seen at any time since we sent 3 million people, 3 million mostly men, abroad during World War II. It would lead to the first significant fall in the population, both of the UK, since World War II. It will be the largest population fall in London that we've ever seen. All of these firsts. The truth is, we just don't know. There are huge question marks about data collection during the pandemic. and I think most people are reasonably sure that there has been a significant net outflow, particularly from London, of people, especially Europeans, returning to their countries of origin, particularly during the first 6 months of the pandemic. And in some sense, it would be amazing if there weren't that outflow. We know that migrants, particularly from the EU, are disproportionately young, disproportionately mobile, disproportionately likely to be employed in customer-facing service sectors were shut down during the first lockdown. We know that London is an expensive city to live in, that most of them live in private rented accommodation. We also know that London, in health terms, was hit worse than almost any other place outside northern Italy during the first round of the pandemic. All of these factors make you think that it would be astonishing if lots of people hadn't left. We don't know the scale, and of course, most crucially, we don't know if they're going to come back. It is easy to construct a scenario whereas a year ago, in April 2020, London was one of the worst places to be in Europe, particularly if you were from the demographic I've just described. It may well be the case that in a couple of months, that the relative success of the UK in vaccinating means that London is one of the best places to be in Europe from an economic and perhaps other points of view. So maybe they'll all come back. I certainly hope so, but we simply don't know. So to end, we are, this really is a reset moment for UK immigration. The uncertainties are absolutely massive. We don't know what the medium term impacts of COVID on migration patterns are going to be. We don't know what will happen to public opinion in the UK post-Brexit. We don't know what's going to happen with Hong Kong. And as always, with migration, we have this choice of whether we want to be global Britain or whether we want to be little England, or as usual, will we fluctuate between the two in a somewhat unpredictable way? I'm sure that will be the answer, but I think that the next few years are particularly uncertain and interesting from all of these perspectives. And with that, I will stop and hand over to Paul James.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this presentation. Thank you for all these elements that are definitely food for thought. It was a broad presentation and includes a lot of issues, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions for you afterwards. And as you said, now we're going to listen to the second presentation by Paul James, who is going to focus on one of your points, as he's going to talk about the UK and high-skilled migration. Paul James, for those who arrived later, is a professor of law, but his presentation is not only about the legal aspects of Brexit, so there will be also political considerations about the consequences of Brexit on migration, and well, we're going to listen to you now, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thibaud, and thank you everyone for coming today. Moi aussi, je suis très heureux d'être là et je suis très désolé que je ne peux pas être en France aujourd'hui. J'espère bientôt que la possibilité de voyager, ça va revenir. I'm going to talk today on many of the similar themes that Jonathan has talked about, and actually some of the points, well, I agree with all the points that he's made, but some of them will illustrate, I think, some of the points that he was making about what was said before, during, and in particular after the referendum. So I'm just going to share my screen as well. And start the slideshow. So I've given this rather long and I'm afraid slightly pretentious title, but essentially what I'm going to focus on a little bit more is about the aspect of high-skilled migration. This is something which hasn't been something that I've focused on a great deal in the past, but I have been looking recently in the context of focusing attention a little bit more on the UK, but also a research project that I've been undertaking with a colleague in Japan, and looking at comparing the UK and its approach to migration, particularly as regards high-skilled migration, with that of Japan. So that is a paper that hopefully will be coming out very soon. So excuse any references to Japan in this, but I think it helps explain how the UK in the post-Brexit situation is in a sense global, and is in a sense able to use this control that it's regained through the Brexit process. But that also reveals some of the dangers or some of the problems in exercising that control, and resulting in avoiding some of the problems that Jonathan mentioned at the end about a declining GDP and so on. We've already heard about the referendum and migration, and I would certainly say and agree with Jonathan that there was a strong focus on free movement, but it was also the conflation in a way that we don't necessarily see in other member states, and particularly debates that I followed in France, where we had this conflation of free movement with the idea of economic migration, but also with law and policy on refugees and asylum as well. All were bound up together, and there was, I think, limited moves, particularly by those running the Leave campaign, to say, well, no, these are actually separate and free movement is this different thing. It did kind of suit a debate that taking back control was much wider than free movement and was actually about far more than that in migration terms, whereas of course in reality the UK already had an exceptional position within the EU, lack of participation in Schengen aspects of JHA and so on as well. Of course, we talk about migration very much in a sense of people coming to the UK, but as we've seen recently, if you've been following the news and following Twitter, there's been quite a lot of debate, which many of us expected about, well, what's going to happen to UK citizens, stereotypically those retirees residing in coastal areas in Spain, who are now faced with a post-Brexit situation of not being able to be resident under the same conditions that they had been before. Again, it's rather a stereotype. It takes less of a focus on working age UK citizens who might be anywhere across the EU. But here we have this, sort of element of surprise now that actually UK citizens in the EU are migrants rather than expats, and the exceptionalism that the UK has been used to as a member of the EU no longer applies, and that rules on third countries and third country nationals do apply. You contrast that with what was said in the referendum, which was that largely British citizens would be unaffected, that even if there were changes in the rules, the nature of the UK being a rich country meant that that people would be treated differently because of the economic benefit that the UK citizens provide, even though many of the, as I say, stereotypical retirees on the costas in Spain are actually not earning money and contributing in the same way as many EU citizens that were or are in the UK. I also agree that the end of the temporary restrictions on Bulgarian and Romanian citizens in 2004 had a big impact as well, not just in terms of the numbers, but it also how that played out politically. There was a huge amount of attention focused on the very first day of the end of restrictions, with sort of many politicians and media sort of descending on Luton Airport, which is the kind of hub for flights from Romania and Bulgaria, and the bus stations, and everything was booked up and so many people were going to arrive, and in the end only one person arrived from Romania looking for a job on the 1st of January, on the year that the restrictions were lifted. But that, I think, resonated then a couple of years later in the Brexit referendum itself. The other thing that I would also add, and again just as a sort of side point, that the way in which migration from the EU had been experienced since 2004 was, I would argue, different to other waves of migration that we've seen in the UK in the past. And that's because the focus was not merely on bigger cities, and particularly London, but the fact that migration affected many, many different parts of the UK, including towns where there hadn't been this experience of migration before. So you could go to smaller towns in the north of England, for example, where I live, and you would see Polish shops, Polski sklep, and so on, opening up and so on. And there was a visible effect of migration, which hadn't really been the case before, or at least not since, for example, the 1960s. So that added a different aspect to migration, which played directly into the focus on free movement and migration in the referendum. Just to have a visual representation of this as well, an image from the campaign, which became very well known. It's not come out particularly clear on here, but you can see under this statement that Turkey, population 76 million, is joining the EU. We can have a semantic discussion on whether includes, is in the process, but is very, very far from joining, whether that's true or not. But what we can see under this here are footsteps leading to an open British passport, which conflates free movement with citizenship, because we've not got a sort of, UK being open, but rather a British passport, which suggests that Turkish enlargement and remaining in the EU and free movement leads to people immediately obtaining a British passport, which is of course false. So we see again this conflation of these different ideas with this sort of underlying idea about numbers, and in a sort of companion advert that went along with this, the idea that the UK's external border, in fact, it was explicitly said in this, and this is the Vote Leave, this is the official campaign that was headed up by Boris Johnson, because Turkey borders Iraq and Syria, that the UK's external border would be with Iraq and Syria if Turkey was in the EU, which would happen if the UK stayed. So there's a conflation of a lot of issues here, and again, played very much into this idea that migration is more than free movement. And so to try and separate those out and say, well, actually, non-EU migration is already within the control of the UK government, that didn't really sort of cut through, if you like, within the debates. And I think that's what made it different, perhaps, to debates in other member states. We've already heard that the theme of free movement continued afterwards, and because I had the benefit of seeing Jonathan's slides beforehand, I actually expanded the quote that I put on here. This was Theresa May's speech, which was given on my birthday. That was a nice thing to write about on that day, in 2017. So this was the speech that really set out, before Article 50 was launched, what kind of Brexit would take. And really, this was a kind of nail in the coffin for any kind of hope, particularly for those who'd argued for Remain, that the UK would try to remain within the single market, or try to have some kind of bespoke Swiss, Norwegian, or somewhere in between model. Here we see that she firmly closes that lid by saying that Brexit must mean control of the number of people who come. Well, if you want control of the numbers, you cannot have free movement, and therefore, if you cannot have free movement of workers, then you can't for any of the other freedoms as well. As I said, I did expand this because this speech reflects some of the myths, popular myths, about what immigration does, which, as you already heard, are not borne out by the evidence about downward pressure on wages for working class people, the pressure on public services, despite the number of EU citizens and migrants generally who actually work in public services, particularly the NHS. So here we see, and to go on to what I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail, the reference to high-skilled immigration as well. This idea that, well, we are not anti-immigration, we are open to immigration, just certain types of it, does provide you with a kind of political cover of being accused of being anti-immigration. So the Brexit vote here was interpreted by Theresa May as being an end to free movement. And again, as you've already heard, that very much fitted it within her view, despite having campaigned rather nominally. I think she gave one speech for Remain and not much else. She wasn't particularly visible, but we already knew from her position as Home Secretary for, I think, 6 years, that reducing numbers was absolutely key to her message and her ambition. Fast forward then to 2019 and the general election, the last general election that we had, where immigration, despite the decline in its overall salience, was nevertheless present, and of course in advance of Brexit actually happening. You had these strong and repeated statements about Australian-style points-based systems and accusations that Labour would go for totally uncontrolled and unlimited immigration systems. So again, playing in this idea that as a member of the EU, the UK's doors were open. There were no immigration controls, whatever, whether it would be for European citizens or indeed anybody else. Again, we've already heard about what the immigration horizon looks like now after Brexit. Well, the end of the free movement of EU citizens was, I'm a lawyer, so I've put a little bit of law in there, the Immigration and Social Security EU Withdrawal Act 2020. We already know that now EU citizens are subject to the same, EU citizens who wish to come, who are not currently in the UK and not eligible for settled status, are subject to the same immigration routes as non-EU citizens. That includes students as well, who will now have to apply for visas to come to the UK. It's also worth mentioning as well that the UK has been has tried to sort of portray itself, or the UK government has tried to portray itself as being very vigorous in concluding new agreements with countries around the world. These, however, are continuity agreements. I think there's about 60 for agreements that the UK was part of. The one which has been sort of lauded as being the genuinely new one is really not genuinely new, and that is the agreement between the UK and Japan. What's worth looking at in a bit more, or what's worth considering perhaps there, is it even where there was scope to kind of maybe expand the provisions on migration, maybe discuss easier access between the UK and Japan, which have a very strong bilateral relationship, then there wasn't even that. I looked at the migration provisions in the new agreement between the UK and Japan, and there's a slight change, some changing in the wording, but really not very much. And so either the UK hasn't sought to include migration in its European agreements, or it's needed the ability to show that it's able to conclude new agreements, and just kept the text as close to the existing agreement with the EU as possible, perhaps changing that in the future. And then we also see this continued Australia, and again I put that in inverted commas, I should also put in points-based as well, because it really isn't a points-based system for two reasons. One reason, as Jonathan said, it's about salary, but also, well, it's not really a system, and it doesn't it doesn't actually in many cases mean anything that's particularly new, because points-based system, as I'm going to talk about now, have actually been in place for some time. Why high-skilled migration? Well, again, if we've already heard, immigration has been or was a headline public issue and has since declined. It is still a salient issue, but there's also public opinion which consistently shows that the public are relatively comfortable with high-skilled migration. These questions pertain to people who are able to offer something for the benefit of the UK, whether it's public service, doctors, and so on, or whether it's their earning capacity as well, contributing to the economy. And there is some data to show that the public is relatively liberal in its views towards high-skill migration, attaching more importance to skills than where people come from or what religion they are. One of the difficulties, though, with looking at high-skill migration is that it's not really defined, or at least you can define it in different ways. And as we've heard, the way in which it's referred to in the UK, or the way in which it's defined in the UK, relates to salary. But of course, you might be high-skilled and earning a high salary, but you might be high-skilled and not, or you might be not particularly high-skilled and nevertheless earning a high salary. So it's one way, if you like, of doing it. But when you start putting it in a global context, then this is where you find the difficulties. And this is one of the challenges that we had to look at when trying to compare categories of high-skilled migration visas and routes and so on with a country like Japan. But it does also apply when you look across the EU as well. So some of the data I have later on that I'll mention towards the end reflects these kind of difficulties. Obviously, bodies like the OECD make some efforts to do so, to make this comparable aspect more meaningful. But essentially, when we talk about high-skilled migration, we often assume that we know what we're talking about, and the context very much changes. And certainly, the political context in which it's been used in the last few years has taken advantage of this flexibility by suggesting at the same time that it's people who are able to contribute to the UK, whether that is in skills or whether it's in economic value, but because of the salary threshold, often both. But I would say that the emphasis is not new, and that we can actually try to look over the last 20 or so years and try and see these different kind of phases in which migration law and policy towards high-skilled migration has changed. The phases themselves do not have the same length. So the first one was a 10-year period under the Labour government. The second one was only 2 years, also under a Labour government, but a different prime minister. And then until now, which is a longer period, but obviously has different governments, but also different prime ministers. And there are distinctions here, as we've already heard about recent moves to relax or to reduce some of the limits on, or reduce some of the restrictions imposed for those wanting to come to the UK under high-skilled migration. The reason for saying this is that because as a member of the EU, there are certain things that you can do in relation to free movement on an individual level. It was always a bit of a myth that free movement is absolute. It is not. What you can do is limited, but EU law does allow you to restrict access to labour markets, particularly on an individual basis. But the UK had never really taken advantage of these for a variety of reasons. And that also then reflects on not knowing, for example, exactly how many people are in the UK or in the labour force and so on, the way in which the statistics are made, but also the way in which things like registration processes and so on work means that there's a great deal of uncertainty. However, with non-EU migration, that is, of course, something that is within the control of governments to do. And because of this importance of this importance of being able to be seen to be doing something about migration, high-skilled migration is often one of the ones that the target, and it doesn't come with any of the kind of constraints we might see with law and policy relating to refugees, where we have international law and obligations and relations with third countries and so on. So we already saw back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the attempts by the UK to attract people from outside the outside the EU under a highly skilled migration program with a points-based system. And we also see this points-based system being referred to, back in the election campaign of 2005. So this is not something which is new, and the UK also was not alone in this. And even then we see references to Australia. So despite the fact that there's this huge emphasis on the Australian system, Australia is long loomed large in migration policy, in high skilled and other aspects as well. To go through all of there isn't the time to go through all of the different phrases, but needless to say, what has happened with these programs sort of consistently over the last 20 years is that they're very often not given a huge amount of time to really sort of run through to make a full evaluation of how many people have come, what's happened to them, where have they gone, and so. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of this salience of immigration within public debate and this need to do something. So there's constant sort of changes and tinkering with systems to try and make it work, but we don't then have the benefit of being able to see longer term what has happened. So here we see programs being revised, streamlined over time. We then see reviews which suggest that again in 2008 that the first attempt to have this sort of points-based system didn't really bring in the kind of people that it meant to. And here we find this points-based system, as we've already heard about, tiers, which remains more or less to this day in terms of this idea of tier 2 being the main route for high-skilled migration. Again, the aim here was to widen the pool beyond the EU, and over time we see further conditions being imposed, English language tests and so on as well. We do see a change though from 2000, and here we do find still the discourse referring to attracting high-skilled migration, but very much the focus after 2010 was about reducing overall migration. So David Cameron put at the heart of his political messaging reducing migration numbers from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands. And this was always going to be doomed to failure, because although you can say, oh, well, he's only talking about non-EU, in the public imagination, knowing which state is in the EU and not, and we'll leave alone the lack of knowledge about the EU generally in the UK, but the idea that this was going to be a success whilst being in the EU and not having control of this free movement mean that this was always a promise that was going to look hollow unless people understand that we're talking about non-EU migration. And even then, as we've said, when we've seen the statistics of the numbers going up anyway, was always going to be a policy that was going to be doomed to failure. There was and we start to see this language of reducing non-EU economic migrants. Well, again, high skill migration, despite the fact that these are people that the UK normally wants and that is promoted as being coming, we're an open country and so on. But this is one of the areas that something can be done about it. And again, as you've already heard, Theresa May had a very, very restrictive, she was Home Secretary, a very, very restrictionist viewpoint, and essentially led the policy on trying to reduce migration, and that included making the conditions for high-skilled migration even more onerous. And again, we've talked through some of the things that were done that only more recently actually changed. So again, what we find is that the kind of changes to the system happen so frequently that it's difficult to really understand long term whether any of these policies work, or whether they might have worked if they'd have been given a longer chance to actually run. So at the moment, the Tier 2 visa and this system has now been applied to EU citizens as well. You must hold a job offer. There is a labour market test. The shortage occupations list can be updated. It has been expanded. The levels of salary have been more recently reduced. But then there are further conditions in order to gain permanent residency and eventually citizenship, suggesting from the Migration Advisory Committee that only a very few numbers of people entering under Tier 2 have actually gained permanent residency. Again, they might have left the UK and so on as well. So again, we've used, because we were doing a comparison between the UK and Japan, the statistics that we've used here are ones drawn from the OECD, but they do illustrate a point that if you look at the numbers of people entering the UK under free movement, then you can compare it quite starkly with those from non-EU. However, so the point of that is by saying, well, assuming that the UK does actually want and need migration for running the economy and filling all of these posts, in order to replace people who might have previously come under free movement under a visa system to the same level is going to be very difficult. Now, if the overall aim is to reduce migration, well, okay, that might work. However, that's when the gaps may well start to appear. And of course, now the UK is in a much more untested scenario of being well, global Britain, is that it's now in competition essentially with other countries, including those in the EU, to attract highly skilled migrants. So some of the consequences then, to draw that to a close, is that, well, has the UK taken back control? Well, yes, it has, although at what cost? It seems to be quite often the discourse about highly skilled migration in particular does rely on the assumption that the UK is an attractive destination and that people will continue to come. And that includes people from the EU, that people won't mind the conditions because the UK is an attractive place. London in particular is an attractive place for people who want to earn a lot of money, that English isn't really a barrier to people who want to come and people should be welcome and so on. But actually, I think this is far from being guaranteed, and that whether EU citizens will want to, and will want to put up not just with the cost of the application of visa, but also the bureaucracy, as well as what life will be like in the UK for an EU citizen arriving who doesn't have the possibility of settled status and so on as well. One of the other consequences about this sort of notion of global Britain or Little England is that, well, we have to take into account what the devolved areas within the UK and the devolved nations. Just over a year ago, just before the pandemic, the Scottish government, which does not have any competence in the area of migration, that is what's called reserved. So the UK government handles, and the UK Parliament handles migration for the UK as a whole. The Scottish government put together some quite detailed proposals about the possibility for a Scottish visa, which was not necessarily only for high skill migration, but had the aim of attracting people to live in the very many and vast rural areas of Scotland, which have witnessed depopulation well, over quite a number of years, but which will certainly lose out from the lack of free movement, especially if people are returning to home countries. So this proposal would be for a visa where people the sort of salary threshold would not apply, and the conditions were made more easily to obtain, but would have to be resident in Scotland. This does work in other countries. The Canadian provinces, obviously Quebec has different policies and so on to the rest of Canada. So it is workable within a sort of multi-legal system country. But the UK government said no immediately to this. Obviously, there's a political aspect as well because of the desire for further devolution and power in the minds of the Scottish government and the SNP. But nevertheless, the retaining of competence on immigration and the desire to get Brexit done in immigration terms is still very, very strong. Now, what we see then is that the UK, as I mentioned a moment ago, is in direct global competition for high-skill migration. And that does depend on whether people will actually want to come to the UK, and that depends on very, very many factors. And often I think the focus is very much on the individual rather than, for example, well, what is on offer? Is it that the UK is just saying, well, yes, you can come if you meet these conditions, but actually this is how we will facilitate. These are the rights attached to what your family might have. These are the costs and so on. How does that compare with other countries? And only time will tell whether the UK is able to do so. What is likely to play a more significant role as the UK tries to show that global Britain actually means something is that when you start talking about trade agreements, and particularly with India, the migration aspect there is very, very important. And the UK government has been very resistant to including migration within free trade agreements. And that means that if the idea that immigration and taking back control and so on means that it must be kept out of agreements on goods or services or whatever, then it's going to be very, very difficult to conclude some of these. And particularly as the UK's foreign policy has now taken a tilt, I think it's called, to the Asia Pacific region. What I think we can assume is that under the current government or under future governments, and the UK is not alone in this, that legislative regulatory changes to migration law will continue and will continue to be frequent. It's very, very difficult, I think, politically for any government to leave migration law alone and see what happens. We see this constant sort of changing to the system. And unlike with, as I said, refugee asylum law, which is also currently within the government's sights to kind of restrict, high-skilled migration is one of those areas under control that is in this constant cycle of being updated. And the downside of that is that I think it's very, very difficult to see how the law and the policy relates to the actual effects on the numbers of people coming, but also importantly, as we heard as well, the number of people leaving the UK. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, for this presentation. Thank you to both of you. And I think now is time to take questions for both of you. I hope there will be a series of questions from the virtual floor. So I'm quite happy to to either to repeat questions that are given in the chat. I can't see any for the moment, but do not hesitate to use the chat box if you want to ask.
Harris, actually.
Yes, Laurence Harris, I think, has got her hand up.
Raise a hand.
Okay, Laurence, if you want to open your microphone, maybe.
Yep. Hi, thank you very much for both talks. I have a question for either Paul or Jonathan on transitional arrangements for the free movement of workers under EU rules. You made a point, Paul, about 2004, when Poland, along the so-called EU8 countries, joined the Union. Now, at the time, France and other countries introduced free movement gradually, as it is entitled to, as they are entitled to under EU rules. But the UK chose to open up its labour market with no restrictions from May 2004. And as a result, received large inflows of workers from these countries. With hindsight, do you consider that this decision could be said to have had a material impact on subsequent policy and the eventual 2016 referendum? Thank you.
You want to take that one first?
Sure. The counterfactual is very difficult. My view is that, to a very large extent, that decision, I'd make 2 points. To a very large extent, that decision was driven by the view that, given the relatively light regulation of the UK labour market, that the impact of transition, given that you couldn't, that free movement of citizens, well, you know, the transitional arrangements didn't apply to stopping people coming into the country, right? You know, there you could not impose border controls or visas to stop Poles or other Eastern Europeans coming to the UK once they joined. You could only prevent them from working legally. But we don't have a labour inspectorate. We had at that time, and still do, but particularly at that time, a pretty light touch approach to labour regulation. So the view in government, and I was in the Department of Work and Pensions at the time, was very much that it would, in practice, be virtually unenforceable. The transitional protection controls would be close to unenforceable. We would just have seen a very large growth in irregular working, which was regarded as highly undesirable. Is that true or not? I don't know, but that was certainly one of the policy motivations. And I cannot imagine that having lots of Eastern Europeans working off the books or irregularly would have been much better politically than what actually happened. The second point I'd say is that remember that, you know, we would still have ended all controls by 2011. And what we saw with Bulgarians and Romanians, as both have just said, is that actually, even though we did delay it for 7 years, we still saw very, very large migration flows. So it might have delayed it, but I'm not sure that in the long run, things would have been that different.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think one of the main ways in which it affected the UK was just because of the way in which the sort of wave of migration just affected the UK in different ways than it had been, you know, in the 1950s or 60s. So communities that were unused to hearing different languages, all of a sudden, you know, Polish became the second most spoken language in the UK over a relatively short period of time. And also the way in which things like recruitment of workers happened meant that quite a few people who knew each other from the same town in, say, Poland, all moved to the same town and already had a sort of community. And so you had this sort of perception that you had different communities and people keeping themselves to themselves, and that kind of thing as well. So it may well have, even if there had been the transitional controls, although I think maybe if the EU member states had acted in a way that, you know, there was a sort of general agreement of what would happen, then particularly with Germany, then perhaps people would have maybe gone there and then not necessarily come on to the UK and so on. I'm not sure, but certainly I think that the way in which all of a sudden, you know, things suddenly changed. That anecdotally, as I mentioned before, you know, I had a shop that opened in 2004, just very close to where I live, that was kind of operated, it was sort of called Mediterranean. I think it was operated by a couple of people of Iranian origin, and then they started to have a small Eastern European section, and that sort of grew, and then eventually just rebranded itself as an Eastern European shop within a period of about 5 years, that you could sort of see the products, you know, changing. And for me, that kind of told a story about how it had changes. There were also side issues as well, which impacted. So I live in the city, although I work in Glasgow, I live in the city of Sheffield, and here the population influx of people was a bit less from Poland, but actually more from Slovakia, with a stronger contingent of people of Roma origin as well, living in one parts of the city. So you had these sort of localized demographic changes as well. And there is no doubt that there was pressure on things like schools and services and so on, and you know, being familiar, despite the fact that, you know, by and large you had people working and contributing and so on. But yeah, it definitely played in. It definitely conflated the sort of EU and non-EU, and that also plays into the lack of knowledge about the EU. When enlargement happened in 2004, I mean, there was less made of, you know, it wasn't really in the news. It wasn't really something that was seen to be kind of important, even less so than the euro, which of course the UK wasn't in either. But so because of this lack of knowledge, you know, it wasn't clear that you know, what effects would be, or that how people sort of calculated that, well, this is what it means being in the EU and so on.
Thank you. Is there any other question from members of the public, if I dare say?
Well, I have a question.
Yeah, please, Romain.
A question for Jonathan. I was very curious about one of your slides, one of your charts that showed that public opinion started warming to immigration or becoming less hostile to immigration over time. And if I looked at the chart correctly, if I understood correctly, this trend started long before Brexit, long before the referendum started under the Conservative governments. And I was wondering if there was more data available on the drivers of this beginning of a warming of public opinion towards immigration at the time when this was the heyday of the start of the hostile environment policy. And
that's right. And the truth is that there is we really don't have a good explanation for the positive trend. I mean, so it has been argued that what happened was that after the financial the most negative sentiments towards immigration came in the latter half of the 2000s, because the Conservatives were campaigning on it, trying to make it a political issue against Labour. It was not that long after the events that Paul described, 2004, people weren't that used to European migration. And then the financial crisis sort of displaced it. And then as a consequence of the crisis and the new restrictive measures of the Conservative government, immigration did fall in the early 2010s. So you could tell a story about that. But I don't think that, the truth is that there isn't a lot of research. I mean, I would like to think that the demonstration, both by economists, but more importantly by reality, that the lump of Labour fallacy doesn't hold. In other words, the fact that employment despite high levels of immigration, employment in the UK employment rates recovered rather quickly after 2008-9 and stayed high. That led to a diminution in the extent to which people were worried about losing jobs as a consequence of immigration. But I haven't got a huge amount of evidence to support that optimistic view.
Yeah, interesting.
There might be one of the other factors as well. Back before the election in 2010 was when the Liberal Democrats were at their kind of peak of popularity, and so there's a famous TV debate where both the Conservatives and Labour were kind of falling over themselves to say, I agree with Nick Clegg, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, also coincidentally my MP, who and so they were trying to show their kind of liberal credentials to attract voters, there, so that the kind of the sort of immigrant bashing, if you like, within that, I don't recall as being particularly strong, at least not in that. Of course, in the tabloids, so that's always been a different story. But in a sense, it was a different kind of political debate, which now seems to belong to a completely
Was that the debate in the 2010 general election campaign? I think.
Yeah. So the kind of TV format debate, which is still relatively new, but where the Liberal Democrats were, I think, polling about sort of trying to remember, about 19% or something like that, or it was breaking the 20% barrier. So this was a big contingent of people to try and attract. So I agree with Nick. I'm a liberal, and not just I'm a liberal, but it means this seemed to be sort of more real, and maybe also which in a sense was not just immigration but other things, to same-sex marriage and so on as well. So but yeah, then the sort of shift and the try and tacking to the right sort of happened later on, and now the Liberal Democrats are not even in my constituency anymore.
Yeah, because I think the shift to the right happened once David Cameron was installed as Prime Minister and veered the coalition government towards the right, probably, maybe.
Vincent, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks for two fascinating presentations first, and they really were complementary, and that was great. So it's more, I don't know if I'm not entirely sure it's a question or remark, and I think it's chiefly aimed at Jonathan, but obviously Paul James is very welcome to reply as well if he has some elements. I was struck by the sharp decline in the number of immigrants over the past year. Jonathan, you mentioned, I think, a decline of around 1 million people in just a year. And I was wondering whether you had more precise statistics about the potential decline in foreign workers within the NHS. I remember actually Theresa May's promise after the referendum to turn the NHS into a 100% British-run public service, and which obviously was totally unrealistic. And I was wondering whether you have some precise elements or figures in relation to that silly promise or plan. Thanks.
Two things. I mean, first of all, the statistics during the pandemic are just are highly uncertain, even at the very high aggregate level, because we've stopped collecting immigration statistics at all, right? Because they're based on surveys of people at ports, and you can't do them. And the population statistics are based on household surveys. And while those have continued, the non-response rates have changed in such a way that they throw a huge element of uncertainty. So we're very uncertain about what's going on. As I said, my view is that a large number of people have left, but I'm very unwilling to be pinned down on the numbers. On the NHS, we don't yet have detailed workforce data, although we will, and that'll give us some idea. I don't get the sense that there's been a huge outflow, although there has been some there have been some anecdotal reports of leaving. More generally, though, I mean, this is one of the areas where, again, the government has opted for a much more liberal approach than Theresa May. The new system includes a specific healthcare visa, which means that the salary threshold effectively does not apply to health professionals. So there is, in contrast to the Theresa May system, where you actually had at one point doctors from India or whatever having to sort of queue up for one of the quota spaces. There's now no quota, and any health professional, which includes not just doctors or nurses, but also somewhat more junior technical staff like radiologists or radiographers or nursing assistants, those people can come in without being subject to the salary cap, with a lower visa fee than for other people, and so on. Now whether, I mean, I think this goes to Paul's point about whether we will, post-Brexit, whether we will be able to successfully recruit people from abroad to come and fill these jobs is another question. But then historically, the NHS has been reasonably good at doing that. But I think the chances of the NHS reducing its overall reliance on foreign workers, there may be a bit of a bump now because of the pandemic, which means both that it's much harder for people to get here, and also that there may be a greater supply of British people going into the sort of more mid-level jobs that might otherwise be unattractive. But in the medium to long term, the NHS will, I think, continue to be quite reliant on people coming from both Europe and outside Europe.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think I've got anything more to add on that. I mean, it would just be interesting to see. And I think, even generally speaking, given the importance of high school migration from the EU, it much depends on whether people will actually, whether people can be bothered to do it, or whether they think actually why should or why not go somewhere else. And I think underpinning that as well, I mentioned the language point earlier on. It used to be the UK was attractive because of English language, and that's the language school people have. But with the prevalence now of English, including in countries like France, where I used to work 20 years ago, was a very, very different place. That actually, I'm not sure that the UK has as much of a pull as it did in the past.
Many thanks.
I've got a question that's come up in the chats by David Fay from Sorbonne Nouvelle as well. He writes, I was wondering if there had been studies or modeling of the impact of the departure of EU migrants, and especially highly skilled ones, on the housing market, especially in London. So I don't know if you've got any idea about this.
I mean, I think that the simple answer to that is no. The housing market is behaving very oddly indeed in the UK. It's actually booming in most parts of the UK. House prices are going up quite rapidly, presumably as a consequence of the fact that there is all this sort of forced saving among middle and upper income people as a result of the pandemic. I mean, there's quite a lot of money washing around, and of course, interest rates are very low. In terms of what's happening in London, that seems to have translated into price rises in outer London, not so much in inner London. And there certainly have been sharp falls in the rental market in inner London. And that is clearly attributable to migration and to reduced foreign demand. Both of international students and of people who have left and people who are not coming. But you know, so there clearly is something going on there. But whether this is just a temporary effect or permanent, I think we genuinely don't know, and that depends both on what happens to migration, also what happens to people's working patterns, whether there is a reduction in the number of the jobs and footprint in central London. And again, there's just huge uncertainty about all of this. No modeling yet that I know of.
I think my only point is anecdotally from as I'll be starting my new job for the next semester, I've sort of been looking at small places to live in central London just as a kind of weekday thing whilst I commute. And, there are quite a few places that have sort of, tried reducing the rent by £200-300 a month. But again, is that the pandemic that people have left, or is it that obviously students haven't come? Who knows? But there
are certainly some vacant buy-to-let apartments in my building, which is very nice and quite convenient for city if you're interested, Paul.
Thank you very much.
We've got a question from Marie Perrière. So if you want to open your microphone.
Yeah, sorry, my camera doesn't seem to be working, so I wanted to apologize for that. I had a question about Erasmus Plus, because the UK government decided to withdraw from the Erasmus Plus program and to replace it with the Turing scheme. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about the future of students and young people in the UK as they seek to develop their personal and professional careers.
I should have said Paul has written extensively on the issue recently, even in the French media in Le Monde. So, Paul, if you want to answer that.
Yes. Well, at the risk of going into a whole other session, I mean, there is a replacement of Erasmus. It's generally regarded as not really a replacement for Erasmus, or similar to what the Swiss did when they had to leave Erasmus several years ago and set up their own system, which cost them more than their Erasmus contributions. Different context, but Erasmus in the UK has not been used as much as in France or particularly Spain or Germany, but the numbers have been going up. It's regarded as being something of a middle class thing in the UK for well-off kids to go and spend, well, the stereotypical example is a year at the Sorbonne, I'm afraid, but this is not always borne out. But there has been a lack of use of Erasmus by those from less well-off families, but I'm not at all clear how the new scheme is going to address that. Setting up a new scheme to replace something that has evolved over 30 years is incredibly difficult. Exchanges will continue because bilateral contracts can continue. So I suspect that most exchange students going out from the UK will go to Europe because many will be doing languages. So France, Germany, Spain would be the destination anyway. I don't see a big uptick in those going far beyond that, even if there is some funding available. And there is no funding for incoming students. So the idea of getting more developing countries on board, India, for example, is going to be fraught with difficulty. The government keeps mentioning Vietnam. I'm not really sure why, but Conservative government wanting to send young people to a communist country was not one of the things that I foresaw as an outcome of Brexit. I've just remembered this is being recorded. So yeah, I would direct you to my blog post on UK and a Changing Europe as well recently, when I gave some evaluation of the new Turing scheme. But I fear that young people will lose out. So I'm rather pessimistic, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
I had a question earlier about something we said about the depoliticization of the issue, and I was wondering whether this could influence the government's policy choices. In other words, could it allow the government to adopt a more open attitude towards immigration now it seems not to be among public priority, as Jonathan underlined? And about this depoliticization, I was wondering whether the debate on asylum is bringing the issue back on at the front.
I mean, I guess my view is that, I mean, you know, immigration is never depoliticized. It just goes through cycles, and at the moment, I think we are going through a cycle where the government does feel it has space to be more liberal on economic migration, and that is very much, as we've seen, very much manifest in both the design of the new system and the approach to Hong Kong. The interaction between the asylum debate and the immigration one is a much more complicated one, it goes both ways. I mean, at the moment, it means that, you know, it is probably, if you were to attribute more in the way of strategy, of sort of deliberate strategic intent to the government, to this government, that I think it's actually capable of, you would say their strategy is to pursue a relatively liberal approach on economic migration, while at the same time throwing the necessary red meat or bones or whatever you want to call it to the tabloid press and their more xenophobic or even racist supporters by being conspicuously tough on asylum and being seen to do that, and that helps them create the space. And whether that is an explicit strategy or whether that's actually how they think about what they're doing, I don't know. But that does seem to, you know, it does to some extent, I think, reflect what's actually happening.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We seem to have a question from Catherine Puzzo in the chat section.
Oh yeah, sorry, I missed that. Catherine, do you want to open your microphone and ask it directly?
Yes, many thanks for your presentation. I'm afraid I arrived a bit late for the first one, but I could hear your conclusions. And I was wondering, when you were mentioning the Migration Advisory Committee, about its exact role, because I'm often surprised by the fact that the government over the years has been ignoring many publications, in particular from parliamentary committee, giving some directions to what the government should do or shouldn't do. And I was thinking in particular when the report on the National Conversation on Immigration was published, that its conclusions seem to have been completely overlooked. And instead, only the views of the Migration Advisory Committee were taken. And I was wondering if anything has been published on the role of this committee.
Well, as I say, I think the Institute for Government report that I posted in the chat is a useful, has some discussion of the role of the MAC and how it relates. I mean, I think, overall the government, the MAC is there primarily to give technical advice and to provide quantitative evidence that allows fine-tuning of the system, as it were. It's not, the basic principles. The idea that there was going to be that the government wanted to end free movement, to equalize between EU and non-EU. The primary criteria would be salary-based. All those were sort of broadly political decisions taken by the government. The MAC has been influential in shaping that, setting the parameters of that broadly towards, and I think the MAC is primarily composed of labour market economists like me, and you can see that in some of their approach, the way they think about things and the way they analyze things, and hence the way that pushes policy. And I write about a little in the paper that I've circulated. I say a little bit about how that sort of has shaped things. But I want the broad strategic thrust of policy is very much driven by politics, not by the MAC. And the MAC has also gone through. The previous chairman of the MAC, Professor Alan Manning of LSE, was sacked by the government for no obvious reason, and I think it's still unclear to those of us outside what that means for the future role of the MAC.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Is there any other question? I've just posted in the chat I hope that it's going to work, the file that was sent by Jonathan. So I suppose it will be on the blog as well later on. But as you were referring to it, I just posted it back here for those of you not yet have it. So I don't know if there's any other question. Otherwise, maybe could be time to stop.
Okay. Well, yes. No, go ahead. Sorry. Finish.
Yeah, I was just going to thank the two speakers again. Thank you very much for these two presentations that were very stimulating, and I think were very interesting to all of you who work on Brexit and Brexit related issues. So thank you very much for these. We were very happy to welcome you here, and of course we hope to see you in the future in Paris or elsewhere in France. So thank you again. And Romain, do you want to say an extra word about the future seminars again for those of you?
Well, yeah, thanks. Very briefly, the next seminar that I mentioned at the beginning of the session, just to repeat, is going to be on Friday, the 21st of May from 10 to 11:15. And that's going to be a talk by David Bousquet from the University of Dijon on the influence of Caribbean migrations on culture and politics in the UK. Thank you again, Thibaud, for organizing this great session. Thanks to our two great speakers for a wonderful session, very informative. Thank you everybody for attending. And don't forget that for future reference to the recording of this session or any other aspect of the MIDIB activities, you can just log on to the blog, midib.hypothesis.org, and find all the information there. So thank you again to everybody. And we hope to see you in as great numbers as today for the next session on Friday, 21st of May.
Many thanks.
Yeah,
everyone.
And thanks again, Thibaud, Paul, and Jonathan for a really nice session. It's great.